Welcome to the 21st workshop in the Return to Freud. This is a ongoing workshop series which seeks to revisit the original Freudian texts and put them into contemporary context. We are going to go over two papers in this workshop from 1913, which are really papers where Freud is attempting to situate psychoanalysis in relationship to more classical disciplines. And I think that this reflects a point in the development of psychoanalysis where Freud is really trying to think about now, once psychoanalysis has gained a type of institutional establishment, now that psychoanalysis has its sort of footing, so to speak, into our society, how should psychoanalysis be positioned in relationship to other forms of knowledge? Specifically, scientific knowledge is his main interest in these two papers, although he does get into fields that you might associate outside of science, like aesthetics, even sociology, you might say, is not a classical science. History, of course. So he thinks about all of these dimensions, the relationship basically between psychoanalysis and the sciences and the humanities. So we're going to get into that and then try to, as we do for all the papers, situate them in relationship to the 21st century context and the conversation afterwards. And I will just share my screen and let's get at it. All right, so the first paper, the most important thing to know for the two papers is that the first paper is going to be dealing specifically with psychology. And the second paper is going to be dealing with fields in the sciences at large, or you could say the sciences and humanities at large. So let's focus first on psychology. First, as he always does in these types of general overview papers, Freud is again redefining really what the aim of psychoanalysis is, reminding people that it originated in a problem, that being the problem of the neuroses. The most common bifurcation of the neuroses being the hysterical convulsions and the obsessional ideas and actions, oftentimes sexuated between feminine and masculine symbolic positioning. And he claims that analysis over the past, now he's dealing here with about 2 decades plus of material and 2 decades plus of analytic work, claims that analysis has made it possible to gain insight into the origin and the mechanism of the neuroses and psychoses. However, that there are still mysteries about the process of transference with the physician, namely how the neuroses and psychoses can be cured so easily and unpredictably in some situations in relationship to the physician. And I think that that is worth dwelling on, that mystery, because so many of our obsessional fixations and so many of our hysterical outbursts are oftentimes about our symbolic positioning vis-a-vis the other. And so in that situation, the mystery of transference here gains a lot of maybe a central focus, you could say. One of the most important concepts in psychoanalysis is transference. And perhaps just speculating that the mechanism of transference is underappreciated and underused in terms of thinking structures that can help us deal with problems in the 21st century. I really like that at the beginning of this paper, he kind of gives a subtle criticism of the quote unquote circle of savants that are attempting to synthesize the sciences. And he claims that this is premature considering resistance of psychology to psychoanalysis. So here, how I want to frame this is, and the reason why I think it's so important to talk about a little bit is because in the contemporary sciences, this still goes on today. This problem is still repeating today. This hasn't gone anywhere. There are a lot of people who are attempting to synthesize the sciences. And at the same time, they don't have any reflective capacity to recognize that psychoanalysis here as a discipline is still sort of here very much at work in history. And there are still very much many fundamental problems and fundamental disagreements between psychology and psychoanalysis, which, if they were to be taken seriously, would potentially undermine the entire attempt to so-called synthesize the sciences, and that is bring psychology and sociology within, the domain of physics and chemistry and biology. So there's no capacity to even think that maybe if we include psychoanalysis, this entire attempt to synthesize the sciences falls apart. Very much worth thinking today. So he goes into focus on how psychoanalysis introduces a few dimensions to psychology which are of relevance to psychology and which psychology has overlooked or paid little attention to. The first of these we're going to be talking about are the parapraxis. Parapraxis meaning slips of the tongue, forgetfulness, haphazard action, dreams, and again, the convulsive attacks and obsessional ideas. You can often hear the parapraxis being referred to in the slogan, slips of the tongue, dreams, and jokes. Jokes, slips of the tongue, and dreams. Here he's adding in a few other dimensions like haphazard action and forgetfulness. So he's claiming here that the parapraxis, which have not received the attention that they deserve in psychology, namely that they in psychology are reduced to somatic or organic factors, have been shown in analysis to have a psychological nature. And this is, again, I think, one of the major dividing lines to focus on as it relates to psychoanalysis being embedded as a form of knowledge, a necessary form of knowledge, that being this split between biology and psychology. That many things about our nature cannot simply be reduced to biological explanations and require actually thinking about the psyche in itself, the psyche as such. And one of the problems, I think, for psychology is simply that when you include the psyche as such, when you include something that requires an actual psychological explanation, you need to include your own psyche into the form of knowledge. And this reflexive inclusion of the psyche as a form of knowledge is, I think, what oftentimes psychologists have a problem with, and my bias here, but I definitely have noticed that there is a tendency in the profession of psychology to produce a lot of paradoxical subjects, namely subjects who know a lot about psychology in general, but have a low understanding of their own psyche and its inclusion in this general knowledge. I think that's quite important. So parapraxis are, again, emphasizing a quote unquote full-blown psychic phenomenon. And what that means is that the parapraxis have meaning, intention, and purpose. So if we go back to haphazard action, if we go back to forgetfulness, if we go back to slips of the tongue, dreams, what Freud's saying is these phenomenon have meaning, intention, and purpose. In other words, they can't just be reduced to biological explanations. They are fully within the psychical domain. And what has to be accepted here, as it relates to the parapraxis, is precisely a split. That meaning that the reason why these phenomena occur is because the psyche is split, and the conscious part of the psyche would simply be, in some situations, embarrassed or humiliated or feel shame or guilt or some other negative emotion, if it were to accept that actually there's an unconscious part of its psyche which is responsible for these strange phenomena, these parapraxis. But to emphasize here, and this is going to be a theme throughout this entire talk, actually, which is that when it comes to the parapraxis, The main sort of function here of the repression is to avoid unpleasure. And so you see here Freud setting up the psychological distinction, which is so important in psychoanalysis, that between the pleasure principle and its opposite, unpleasure. And ultimately, we're not yet at beyond the pleasure principle, but here's setting up this dualism between pleasure and unpleasure. And as it relates to the scientific subject, I think this is worth emphasizing. When you have scientific subjects who are interested in synthesizing the sciences, what they are not including is their own pleasure, their own, that they would find it pleasurable to unify the sciences. In other words, to find out that the unification of the sciences was somehow an impossible project or somehow fundamentally to be undermined would be defended against, as that would be a way for them to avoid unpleasure, and namely confronting their own unpleasure. And that's the weird thing about psychoanalysis, is that you have to go against yourself in some deep sense. You at least have to go against the way in which you can so easily undermine yourself by becoming regulated by the pleasure principle. So there are other reasons for the parapraxis, other than just repression, which we don't need to talk about too much. Freud doesn't spend too much time talking about it. But he does say that the parapraxis in general have a great consequence for our psychological worldview. And I think that this is actually a Hegelian lesson, to be honest. And the lesson is simply that normal people, when we're interacting in the world, when we're interacting in general with people, that their motives are fundamentally contradictory many times. And that behavior is not as accidental as we might seem. It's simply that people's motives are contradictory. And I think that this is really important to think on, also in the context of the science of behaviorism. Because in the science of behaviorism, they attempt to eradicate attention to motivation, motivational systems, motivational structures, and instead just focus on external behavior. Now, what behaviorism achieves in this abstraction is a non-contradictory worldview. You can get a coherent worldview. You can get a coherent worldview where you don't have to worry about people's motives. But when you're dealing with real people in the real world, you have to deal with contradiction. And that also might be seen as unpleasurable for a lot of people, because it makes normal day-to-day life a lot more uncertain. It makes things a lot more open to interpretation, let's say. So when we think about things like people forgetting information, oh, I forgot to call you for coffee yesterday, or losing an object, I left my computer at work by mistake, destroying relations and connections, getting into certain habits of coming together in a partnership and breaking up in a partnership, or certain relationships with a hierarchical figure, making a connection with a hierarchical figure and then abandoning the hierarchical figure, for example. These are all for Freud not accidental. These are related to the unconscious motivation structures of the subject. In other words, they're secret intentions, meanings, and purposes laden in all of these weird human phenomena. Here, I just have an image on the right-hand side of a heart and a head. Just metaphorically here, people split between, their maybe it's a simplistic representation, but here a pretty deep split when it comes to, again, symbolic positioning of the self in relationship to the other. So first we're focusing on parapraxis. That was its relationship to psychology. Next, we're focusing on dreams. Psychoanalysis, obviously at this point, has embedded itself as a mode of knowledge which is concerned with dreams. And Freud says that it was the destiny of psychoanalysis to come into conflict with official science, so-called. Where again, he's defining official science as that dreams can simply be reduced to a somatic phenomenon. Again, we see here this fundamental conflict in psychoanalysis, that of being this rift between the body and the mind, where psychoanalysis identifies that dreams, again, like the Parapraxis, have a psychological meaning. They have a purpose to the subject's psychological life. And so you can see here why a scientific subject might have some resistance to the idea that there's something about their own mind which they are unaware of. Something about their own mind which might be representing things which seem strange or uncomfortable or even humiliating. I don't think we can overstress the degree to which the confrontation, the inner confrontation with negative emotion, being something here which is one of the primary battles for psychoanalysis. And people who come to psychoanalysis are by definition in a negative emotional state. They're by definition feeling like their life is beyond their control. They're by definition feeling that there's something about their life which is in need of this type of analytic attention. So specifically also when it comes to confronting this negative emotion and why it's so problematic potentially, is because he claims here that the view on dreams throws light on the most intimate details of the human mind. And I think this is another huge tension with science, because when we think about science, it almost functions on the repression of the deepest possible intimacy. When I think about psychoanalysis in this respect, then it really is about bringing to our consciousness and attempting to formulate in a knowledge the most intimate parts of our being. And that just requires a type of self-reflexive willingness on the part of subjects to be interested in that, to find that worth doing. So dream interpretation is the foundation of psychoanalytic work. We've already covered, I highly recommend previous workshops if you haven't seen them, where Freud goes into the main distinctions here about dream expression. I don't want to go too much into it because we've covered it extensively. Of course, we have the manifest content, the latent content, and we have the dream work, where the dream work is really the unconscious work of where he's introducing new psychological phenomena like condensation and displacement of ideas. Condensation is the combination of ideas into a contradictory image. Displacement is where one idea is standing for a displaced idea to sort of to distract you from the actual cause or the motive of the dream. And these are mechanisms in the unconscious, play of forces that are concealed from conscious perception. And the reason why, and this is again linking everything here, parapraxis, dreams, and what we're talking about next, it's mostly about censoring unpleasure. Again, the crucial thing here is that the human being can deceive itself in a pleasure bubble. The human being can deceive itself by going after what's pleasurable and comfortable instead of going after what's true and unpleasurable. So the dream work functions to guard sleep. Now, I think that's just infinitely fascinating. I just every time I read about this, it gives me new ways of thinking about dreams. The idea that they're guardians, the idea that dreams is like a fortress or a guard on our sleep. I don't want to go too much into speculation about this, but I do think it's interesting that I often hear that old people, or when you get older in general, that it's harder to sleep. And I wonder if this has some functional relationship to the dream work losing its capacity to guard you against death, or to guard you against something inside yourself that you're scared to confront. Yeah, I don't know. It just makes me think a lot about that. So the dreams and the parapraxis are traces of the same intention, like I've been emphasizing, the avoidance of unpleasure. and that the unconscious psychological activity is more comprehensive and important than familiar activity of consciousness. Namely here, we can here bring in metaphors like our consciousness is impotent. And of course, when you're dealing with science, oftentimes the consciousness of the scientist or the subject imagines him or herself to be powerful, imagines him or herself to be potent. So the idea that actually, no, you're really impotent, and you're impotent in relationship to your own unconscious psyche, that is perhaps understandably unpleasurable to hear. So the next is, so we've had parapraxis, dreams. The last thing we're going to be talking about as relation to psychology is the psychopathologies. And now this is the most unpleasurable, because this is unpleasure itself, you could say. Which, now, unpleasure itself, which strangely enough, neurotics and psychotics gain a strange enjoyment from. So the psychological motives here are being reached. And here you can see that psychoanalysis, as compared to behaviorism, is actually interested in motives. It's interested in psychological motives. It's not trying to repress psychological motives. It's not trying to ignore the existence of psychological motives. It's not trying to come up with a framework of knowledge which is disconnected or detached from psychological motive, and so forth. So what hysteria is, and again, I would emphasize that people go back to our first workshops if they haven't watched them yet, because that's where I go into extreme detail with what Freud said about hysteria and obsessional neuroses. Here, I could just merely repeat that in hysteria, you have an increased emotional excitation or outbreak of affect. And the unconscious here is dominating the subject's emotional life to the point where it's no longer pragmatic, to the point where the subject can no longer function in day-to-day life. So these first subjects, these hysterical subjects who were the first sort of work of psychoanalysis, these people could not function, could not live in normal day-to-day life. So there was just a struggle for basic existence. Whereas the obsessional has a distressing, senseless repetition, or a mysterious prohibition, which Freud here says is a struggle with both temptation and moral restraint. So you can here see how sexuality or temptation on the one hand, and religion or moral restraint on the other hand, gain such a strange relationship at the foundation of psychoanalytic knowledge. It's really going to the core of our minds here, even thinking about how religion emerges or why religion would emerge. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So in summary, we've talked about the parapraxis, we've talked about dreams, and we've talked about psychopathologies. Freud is saying that these things have an incredible importance to psychology, and that psychology has not paid enough attention to them. Psychology has been more concerned with coming up with a general abstraction of the psyche, as opposed to going into the actual problems of the psyche, you might say. Now, he says that psychoanalysis has revealed in this multiplicity of mental processes that the cause of all of them is the unconscious mind. And of course, the unconscious mind is what psychology has a weird relationship to. So that's the interesting thing. Now, he does say that psychoanalysis points to psychology for half of the problems of psychiatry, but not all of them. Namely, that there are some problems about the human being, namely the other half of problems about the human being, which are from organic or somatic factors. So he's here just identifying, look, we can't put everything in the organic somatic box. Some things go in the organic somatic box, some things go into the psychic box in terms of causation for a certain problem. And that psychoanalysis ascribes a primacy of mental life to affective processes. Namely, we are emotional, intimate beings. We cannot get out of that. We cannot pretend we are not that. And that the intellect has a tremendous capacity to repress this fact, simply, that we are affective beings. So you could imagine that's why there's a tremendous amount of tension here with the sciences. So that's the first paper. The second paper is going to be basically a general overview of how Freud imagines the relationship of psychoanalysis to the non-psychological sciences. This also includes subjects in the humanities, as I've already emphasized. The subjects he's going to be dealing with here in order: first is philology, next is philosophy, biology, developmental sciences, history and civilization, aesthetics, sociology, and education. So one by one, and each of these will have its own slide. Very simply, we'll work through them, and then we'll open it up for conversation. First, as it relates to philology, philologists are experts in speech, and as it relates to psychoanalysis, analysis is interested in the language of dreams and translating the language of dreams into waking speech. In that sense, psychoanalysis is interested in a dream language. And this dream language, of course, is extremely old, since humans have been dreaming for probably as long as there have been, well, at least we've been dreaming in a language for as long as there has been language. So the dream language is an archaic system. It's an extremely old system, and we can learn about the origin of language and the way language works, potentially, in studying dreams. Freud emphasizes that in dream language, this is very interesting, there is no negativity, meaning that contradictory speech unites itself sort of with contrary meaning. And this is, again, the work of condensation. So that's what he's describing here. The condensation process sort of obliterates contradiction. Or rather, contradictory speech is not seen as a negativity. And that this, Freud claims, is similar to the oldest roots of historical language, where the oldest root meanings of historical language, they combine contradictory meanings into one. Now, the dream language also represents sexuality. So it's very close to our embodied existence. It's very close to our pathos. And he says it's probably related to the earliest phases of linguistic development. It makes sense because, and again, it makes sense that something that was focused on this would come into conflict with science, because science as a language is very sophisticated, and it's very new in relationship to language as a whole. So psychoanalysis is just interested in this archaic dimension of language, which is, again, representing sexuality and representing contradiction. And it does this using images over words. This is, again, in contradiction with science, because, and especially for mathematicians, because, or physicists, because physicists are very skeptical of images, technically, or physicists tend to be skeptical of images, and they tend to have confidence or certainty in equations, which are the most reliable for certainty and to eliminate contradiction. Anyway, the unconscious expression uses images over words. Moving on to philosophy, I can summarize this very quickly because we've already covered it and already talked about it quite a bit. Namely, Freud says that insofar as philosophy is built on psychology, philosophy cannot ignore unconscious mental activity. That the philosophical unconscious has only ever been presented in a mystical instead of a psychological sense. So here, Freud is making the distinction, and this is relevant to, for example, many disagreements, let's say, between Freud and Jung. Freud is basically saying that in order to take psychoanalysis philosophically to be philosophically sophisticated about psychoanalysis, you have to raise the unconscious from a mystical notion to a psychological notion. That's the main point. Now we can get into disagreements about that. And I think there's a huge conversation about that, but that's anyway what Freud's emphasizing. And philosophy can also be subject to, the other thing is that philosophy can also be subject of psychoanalytic interest. And I think this is really fascinating. He says that philosophical theories and systems are unusually, among the rest of our knowledge, the work of a, quote, small number of men of striking individuality. So it makes sense that Freud would say that psychoanalysis would be interesting here to apply to philosophy. Basically to psychoanalyze the greatest philosophers. Actually, that's something that motivates a lot of my work, I think. Oftentimes I say, for example, just to give a concrete example, I often say that instead of deconstructing Plato, as has often been done in the last 2 centuries, it would be much more interesting to psychoanalyze Plato, or apply a psychoanalytic lens to Plato, or I mean, in general, I'm just saying this as an example. Could be done to Kant. It could be done to any of the great philosophical thinkers of the past. As it relates to biology, psychoanalysis emphasizes the sexual function in relationship to mental and practical life. In other words, you have to see the psyche and the soma as in some sort of weird split relation within itself. Now, he emphasizes that sexuality has always been emphasized by creatives as extremely important, but has always been de-emphasized in the sciences. Why is that? Why are creatives so convinced of the importance of sexuality? Why are scientists tend to be resistant about it? This is a huge, important metaphysical tension that's really worth giving some thought. Also, infantile sexuality, we are sexual from the very first, he says, in perversions. Now, this is perhaps the idea in psychoanalysis which received the most vicious resistance. The idea that we're sexual from the beginning, the idea that our sexuality is perverse, polymorphous perverse. This is seen as incomprehensible and vicious. And this has a deep connection here to the final slide. So I would just ask to keep that in mind for the final slide. And finally, the adult sexuality emerges in a developmental process from infantile sexuality, and crucially, another sort of blow to the head of the adults, never achieves an ideal perfection, and predisposes the individual to illness, and that there's this ongoing conflict. Instead of imagining adults as reaching some ideal perfection, he's saying that the adults are constantly in a conflict between sexual instincts and ego instincts. There's just this ongoing contradiction. It's very unsettling, very anxiety producing. As it relates to the developmental sciences, psychoanalysis emphasizes psychological development by tracing psychical structures back into time, ultimately to a type of infantile amnesia. Now, I can't help but making these structural similarities here between the way psychoanalysis tries to understand our mind back to a state of infantile amnesia, and the way physicists trace back the development of our universe to a type of primordial state which cannot really be observed, the unconscious of the physical universe, namely the Big Bang and the conditions of the Big Bang, or the birth of the universe, to use the metaphor, which fits here perfectly. The infant psyche here is not only decisive, but indestructible. Namely that the earliest experiences we have never leave. They are the ground of our psyche. What I've been observing more and more in myself in the last few days and weeks is I'm pretty sure that something related to the oral drive for me, well, I think probably maybe for everyone, but for me certainly, the oral drive is the oldest psychological structure in my mind. The desire to eat, especially at certain times of the day, is so intimate and so deeply rooted. It's just insane. It's just and indestructible. I can't get rid of it. So anyway, that the infant psyche and the indestructibleness of it means we will always come back to our first loves. And Freud says that this plays a lot of a high role in the riddles of our sexual life as adults. So it's surprising, he claims, that infantile mental formations never perish, but are rather overlaid and held back. This is also a terrifying view of the mind. The way he describes the structure here is that impulses are, quote unquote, waiting for the chance to become active if the higher structures fail. And the higher structures will fail. So they're just waiting to pounce, and I've seen this operating in myself in the last year in a major way. But just that if the higher structures of your adult ego start to break, if the higher structures of your adult ego don't receive the recognition you think they deserve, and they start to provoke, they start to become too expensive for you to maintain, let's say, then the more primitive structures will start to dominate. Now moving on to history of civilization. Psychoanalysis, he claims, throws light on the origin of religion, morality, justice, and philosophy. He attributes them to unconscious motivations, namely the attempt to bind unsatisfied wishes. So in the case of religion, there's an attempt to bind an unsatisfied wish of what? Unity with God. What's the desire for unity with God? The desire for maybe the original unity we feel in the womb. Who knows? That's just my own, that Freud doesn't say that, but I have heard people say that. Morality, justice. We live in an immoral world. Immoral things happen all the time. Injustices happen all the time. The whole attempt to come up with a complex morality, the whole attempt to come up with a complex justice system is to rectify that absence, to fill that lack. Then finally, as it comes to philosophy, what's philosophy interested in? Philosophy is interested in absolute knowledge. Philosophy is interested in the naive absolute knowledge about everything. You think about the first scientific philosophies of Newtonian paradigm, where you have a deterministic universe where everything is known. Philosophy is an attempt to bind this wish, to make this wish actual. Mental mechanisms. Here in civilization, he's saying that the mind is mostly related to relieving the individual of tensions created by his needs. Again, this distinction between biology and psychology. And that the primitive belief in an omnipotence is here the desire that I as an individual could fully achieve, could fully meet all of my needs. This is a type of magical thinking, of course. But that the principle of civilization is, again, and this is connected to our last talk, is to avoid unpleasure on a social level. It's kind of like a fractal here. He's trying to talk about psychoanalysis on an individual level to a social level. It's kind of like a fractal where on the individual level, there's many mechanisms to avoid unpleasure. And then on the civilizational level, there's many mechanisms to avoid unpleasure. And the institutions are just such mechanisms, trying to institute the pleasure principle. So you can see why there's so much resistance to psychoanalysis on that level. Makes a lot of sense. A few more now. Aesthetics. Psychoanalysis, he claims, throws some light onto art and artists, but not all, mainly. And this is, I think, super interesting, is that he says that there's a dimension of art and a dimension of artistic creativity that escapes psychoanalytic attention altogether. And he doesn't say that necessarily, or doesn't talk about any other subjects in that way. Art seems to have a special place in Freud's thinking. He claims that art as an activity is attempting to gratify wishes in the same way that other institutional structures are. He claims that first, art tries to satisfy wishes in the artist, and second, in the audience. And that this same mechanism is at work in the construction of our institutions. Now, the most interesting thing he says about art, and I think this is where art kind of escapes psychoanalysis and in some sense requires, again, philosophy to come in, is that he calls artistic reality a halfway between frustrated wishes and wish fulfillment of the world of imagination. And he claims that this reality is where the primitive striving for omnipotence is in full force still. I just think this is a fantastic way to think about art. And also, when it comes to my own sort of mind, I personally really gravitate towards, for example, the surrealists. And I like thinking about surrealism as this halfway reality between frustrated wishes and a wish-fulfilled world, where the almost like the surrealist is, again, this undead striving, or this immortal striving for the full force of the unconscious psyche. I think this is the final slide. No, two more slides, and then we're out of here. So sociological interest is basically that here social life can be a cause of the neuroses, and that neuroses in general are striving for an asocial existence for the individual. Specifically, that they drive the individual out of society and into a safe monastic seclusion. So that really makes me think about whether people who are living a monastic life or people who are living a secluded life are actually in a neurotic or hysterical state. So where do I want to emphasize here? Or what do I want to emphasize here? Namely, that there are social conditions and requirements which are put onto us, which can contribute to the neuroses, and that there's just a constant battle between the individual and the society as it relates to restriction and repression of instinct. And there's no really easy solution to that battle. Namely, because if you just have unbounded instinct, obviously that doesn't help anything. And if you have total restriction and repression, obviously that doesn't help out anything either. So there has to be basically a dialectical balancing act here. And that's basically all I want to emphasize here for the sociological dimension. And this is the final part of this paper anyway. As it relates to the education interest to psychoanalysis, he emphasizes that adults need to overcome their infantile amnesia, namely their psychological estrangement from their own childhood, and that can help them to better understand and educate children. Namely, that if we're more in touch with our own inner child, we are going to be better parents and better teachers to children. We need to feel our way into the minds of children. And I want to emphasize that there's every right for the child not to understand an adult, but there's really no reason why an adult shouldn't understand a child, since they were children at one point. So childhood education is, he says, misleading and incomplete due to overlooking infantile sexuality. And by infantile sexuality, he means the Oedipus complex, What's that? Desire to sleep with your mother, kill your father. The self-love and narcissism, which is grounded in childhood mentality. Also perversions and sexual curiosity, that children are naturally polymorphous perverse and they naturally have a sexual curiosity. We should be aware about this. And this is really the most important point here at the end. And what I wanted you to hold on to, this idea that as it relates to infantile sexuality and the perversions, is that the formation of character can be found in the asocial and perverse instincts if they're not repressed, but sublimated. And this is a very Nietzschean point. I think this is like the way Freud ends this paper is super Nietzschean, because he says here, the highest virtues come from our worst dispositions. And he's basically here talking about the beyond good and evil, the axis of development here as including evil, including our worst dispositions. So I can summarize, actually. I do have some slides summarizing, where here you'll just see a slide summarizing the relation of psychoanalysis to philology, the relationship of psychoanalysis to philosophy, to biology, and to the developmental sciences. I'll just leave that there just in case it's of interest to anyone, either watching now or watching after. But I think I'm not going to describe it again. And then next slide there is the summary of Freud's view on the relation of psychoanalysis to history, aesthetics, sociology, and education. I'll just leave that on there for anyone who finds that worth capturing. And then finally, where we started, psychoanalysis' relationship to psychology. And again, that's just in relationship to the unconscious mind, the parapraxis, the dreams, and the pathology. And I'll end there. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for being here, and we can just open it up. And I've talked a lot, but I can continue talking, even though Eric, you got your hand up. Go for it, please.
Yeah, I'll open it up. One of the things I noticed, and you touched on a little bit, is I think what Freud is working with here in his notion of science, Wissenschaft, is probably a lot more of a broader understanding of science than we work with. I think he still understands the word Wissenschaft to be something like the way that Hegel or Schelling would use it, as something that encompasses the entirety of human learning and understanding, which really, I think, leads into some notion of epistemology, such that at the root of what he's really saying is, how does psychoanalysis undermine our notion of epistemology? It's interesting. There's a passage in Lacan's Seminar 19, the third session, where he, in regard to the sexual non-relation, shows how psychoanalysis, through understanding the sexual non-relation, undermines what he calls connaissance, which could be translated just as epistemology, or knowledge. And so that's, I think, at the root of what he's doing, because if you notice, he's not at any case, at any point in these two papers, he is not addressing science, modern science per se, in terms of its criticism of psychoanalysis. He's not engaging in a polemic or anti-polemic with quote unquote science. For example, he's not addressing the issue of non-falsifiability, or how psychoanalysis goes about collecting observations and data and so on. So just from the beginning, to kind of set the stage, so to speak, for our discussion, it's almost in the sense, and by addressing the notion of science, he's he's talking about everything but science in the way that we would understand it. I also wanted to address the notion of or his remarks on philology, because I am a philologist, I guess. And when I read that session, my feeling about it was this was like this open invitation to Lacan to do everything that he did with bringing in structuralist linguistics and a kind of combinatory logic, which is how the discipline of philology played out mostly through the 20th century, was by bringing in structuralist linguistics. So what is philology? I think a lot of what Freud may be talking about here in terms of philology, we would call linguistics, Saussurian linguistics. But I think it's interesting here that philology, as it's actually practiced, in contrast to linguistics, is a discipline, a practice where we read an ancient text in an ancient language, typically, in order to get at some meaning in that text so that we can understand something about the history of that period, the religion, the culture, and so on. And often those languages that we deal with are imperfectly understood. Sometimes they are even partially documented or not well understood in terms of vocabulary and grammar, so that you may be dealing with what Lacan would call, using structuralist terms, signifiers that do not have a proper signified. We don't know what a word means because we've never encountered it before, or we have a grammatical construction that we've encountered, but we don't know what it means. And so we have to use its relation to other signifiers in order to kind of locate a meaning. Now, here's where I think it's important, is that the philologist, in doing this, what is he or she really getting at? What kind of meaning is the philologist wanting or expecting to find? And it's precisely something that is sort of on the surface. It's history, religion, culture, and so on. But what philology has failed to account for, as well as all of these other disciplines that Freud is talking about, is what Badiou would call the doctrine of the subject, the meaning that is within the subject, that meaning that Lacan says is only half said. And so this is where I think in relief, then psychoanalysis comes into play, where psychoanalysis uses a lot of the same tools that philology does, taking an imperfectly understood language, the language of the unconscious, the raw signifier, and it attempts to piece together a meaning, an interpretation. But that interpretation, that meaning, is not on the surface of the life of the analysand. It penetrates into the depths of that person's unconscious, and as you were talking about, the motives, the unconscious motives that create the symptom. So I just hope with those comments that kind of frames our discussion a little bit. I'll cede the floor.
Mika, do you want to pick up?
Yeah.
From
Yeah, in this connection, I think that it would be really interesting also to focus on what Freud discusses right after philology, namely philosophy. In reading, I found it really interesting that when Freud gets to philosophy here, he really has to sharpen his own view, sort of condense it, and to bring into view the very conflict of the idea that he is presenting to philosophy, or maybe we could also say to the broader worldview that preceded the kind of Freudian framework. So in the paper itself, well, Freud is asking firstly the question that would only the therapeutic effects of psychoanalysis suffice for being a philosophically or scientifically interesting, relevant practice? Not really, but what he's building on in these papers is the idea that there is something else also that's really crucial for understanding the universal condition. And I would like to highlight that this is also the point where I think there is a line of thinking in 20th century psychiatry where this is the exact spot where they always launch certain reproach for Freud for going beyond the clinical. I mean, Freud is extrapolating from his findings things that universally characterize human beings, society, and so on. So there is a line of reproach against Freud here, that saying that no, you cannot universalize from the findings that you see on the couch in the clinical setting, and you should only focus on the isolated practice as a separate part of the world. But ultimately, I could say that this type of approach to psychoanalysis, trying to reduce it to just one ontic practice, one could also almost say that it contains a sort of like a vacuum view of the person and it's a person's mental life. Since if our mental life that we present in the couch or in the clinical setting can be isolated, or vice versa, if society can be detached from the productions of the individual on the couch, then we must say that the mental life of the person is in a vacuum, truly, and there is no connection to the higher, to the very relevance of psychoanalysis to our mental life. But really, I found it interesting that philosophy is the point where Freud has to really sharpen his view and his critique of the preceding worlds. So he's saying that the philosophical systems have been the work of a small number of men who are of some kind of striking personality. And in no other science does the personality determine the results so much. But I think that it is very open for us to question whether this would be even philosophy. I mean, we might also note here that Freud had a very limited knowledge of the classical philosophers. As far as I know, he never really did read Hegel. And he really didn't. If he understood Kant, it was a very limited understanding. And what he is saying that, I mean, there was a point that was not included in the presentation. He's saying that there is another way in which psychoanalysis would benefit philosophy. So he's saying that in the same way, psychoanalysis can indicate the subjective and individual motives behind philosophical theories, which have ostensibly sprung from impartial logical work and can draw a critic's attention to the weak spots in the system. But isn't this exactly what all philosophers have always done? I mean, there is nothing new in here, and Freud thinks he is very innovative here. And if philosophy were like, I mean, Freud is saying that conjectures can be made from artists' works to the intimate personal life behind it. And he's saying that this applies to philosophy. But would this be philosophy? If philosophy was a poetic practice, something like 100% art, then maybe Freud would be right here. We could think of like post-structuralist views of philosophy as some kind of productive practice. But is this really philosophy then? I mean, if we go to the very core of what philosophy as a practice is, do we find even philosophical systems there? Where does philosophical systems exist? Are they in some kind of isolated space? I mean, we must question the very view of philosophy that Freud is applying here, but also it's interesting how philosophy forces him to be more exact. And one could also almost like quote Hegel in saying that to do philosophy, it is above all required that each thought be grasped in its full precision, and that one is not content with vagueness and indeterminacy. Well, yeah, there's a soapbox speech for you about philosophy, but if you have something other to say, but please go ahead.
I like Alain Badiou's synthesis of some of these strands in the opening chapter of Being an Event, where he says philosophy now has to encompass three separate systems: classical ontology or metaphysics, what we can think of as just as a classical philosophy, and then mathematics and logic, what comes under the guise of analytic philosophy, which he doesn't dismiss, but he says it has to be considered kind of as its own system. And then he brings in the Freudian doctrine of the subject. And so he kind of sets out all three as kind of separate but related disciplines that all have to kind of coexist. Recognizing that each one of them has kind of deficiency in relation to the others. And so I think what's interesting about that is that it opens philosophy up to a broader kind of Wissenschaft, just to go back to what I was saying earlier. You know, it's in a way, it's a much broader, more universal picture of philosophy, I think, that does take into account the notion of the subject, but also brings in the Freudian notion of the unconscious of the subject into dialogue with logic and mathematics and, you know, and all of that sort of thing, which is something that Lacan definitely tried to take forward.
You know, I think this is one of those, it speaks more about the territory that they're not willing to cross, Freud and Jung himself. Because I remember Jung saying that he would follow a more Platonist line of thought, but because he's so conscious of his own unconscious workings, that he would never be able to become a philosopher. And I think Freud is kind of admitting this in the same way, except indirectly, right? But I think for him, it's probably like, this is what psychoanalysis could provide, but I don't want to even go there. I don't want to even cross that line myself in some ways. At least that's how I interpret it. It sounds very Nietzschean as well, where I think that quote from Nietzsche where he says, all philosophers are really, it's like a biographical. All their works is basically biographical. I feel like that is the understanding that Freud has, and that's the same understanding that Jung has, still, in my opinion. That's just what I got from them. But yeah, that's just how I read it when Freud was talking about that.
I have a question. When it is said that philosophy is based in psychology, did I get that right? It was on one of
he said he made the distinction that insofar as philosophy is based in psychology. So if that makes sense, if that makes sense. He's kind of saying that
it is,
insofar as it is. So that he might be leaving room for a dimension of philosophy which isn't based in psychology. I don't know if
Okay,
anyone
but
else
where did he come from when he's saying that it could be based in psychology? I just didn't. Where does this idea come from?
Well, I think the idea that all philosophers are speaking from the point of their own consciousness, that they are consciousness, and so that they are philosophizing from that point. So insofar as philosophy has psychology as its ground, his distinction here of the introduction of the unconscious will have a relevance. Does anyone else have a better, or maybe
Well, for me, it's the claim that philosophy as a practice depends on a certain type of peculiar personality. That might be one way to take it, but another way would be that the person who is practicing philosophy has a certain constitutional disposition or certain idiomatic approach which determines what he or she finds interesting and how does the person react to this interesting phenomenon and what kind of questions do they bring forward. But I would be very skeptical of this being a kind of like meta-philosophical answer to the question of what is philosophy. I mean, if you go and practice philosophy, what do you find? That's the question. I don't think that you, in the core of it, find a system which, in Freud's view, would be determined by the personality of the practitioner of philosophy. If that would be the case, then philosophy would be art. But we find philosophy practiced in a way that is detached from art also today.
Honestly, I don't think it has anything more to do with other than the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Ontology or metaphysics still proceeds from this basic fact of thinking, which is a psychology, so to speak. Descartes has to do a kind of psychology in saying cogito before he can derive from that ergo sum, any kind of ontology. So philosophy, insofar as it theorizes ultimate reality, has to proceed from a basic, psychology.
Can I say something?
Sure, unless Sandra, did you have anything else you wanted to expand upon before
Yes,
Alexandra?
I could. I just. I don't know. I don't know why. It's. Is it that it's since thinking comes from a conscious state, then therefore it is based on psychology? Is this like a simple way to put it? But
Well,
this
I
has
think,
been.
I think maybe building on what Eric said about the cogito is that he's saying philosophers have almost presupposed this thinking as and their conscious thought as the basic starting point for a philosophical system. And I take Mika's point about the philosophical system thing being too simplistic, a reduction of philosophical activity. But Freud's saying that ultimately what he's introducing is that philosophy has to take into account unconscious thinking.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's the point he's trying to make in that section of the paper is psychoanalysis has revealed unconscious thinking, and insofar as psychology is based on conscious thinking, we have to take into consideration this new distinction.
Yeah, and we could also think the way that Nietzsche somewhere says something along the lines that he divides reality or that he devised the development of thought itself, there is this kind of like midday point of the shortest shadow where something is presented and you just cannot ignore it anymore. And Freud is proceeding from this hypothesis of the unconscious, and he is saying that philosophers either must be acquainted with the unconscious in the sense in which he presents it, which is not the philosophical unconscious. It's not something that has to do with the body. I mean, there is this idea of a new unconscious going on in a philosophical system called cognitive science, which has only to do with the somatic factors. And it's a kind of a refusal of the Freudian unconscious, which proceeds from parapraxis, from dreams, from symptoms. And he's saying that we either have to accept it or reject it. That's the deal. And if I make also, I mean, if we are going into the Cartesian territory about the most certain principle of philosophy for Descartes being that the proposition that I think I am is true, then we must also accept the fact that the certainty that Descartes brings, it's not about the most obvious sense of thinking. He isn't discussing here Descartes in his cogito proposition, the famous idea about there being certainty about existence in thought, about ordinary thoughts. It's a way of saying that there is something very concrete about the very origin of thought. I mean, it's more difficult or more complex to explain here than is presently available. But I think that it has to do with the unconscious, ultimately.
Okay, Alexandra, did you want to go next?
Yes, I would like to try to answer in a way to the problem Mika and Sandra raised. And I propose to think about trying to integrate in a way in this adventure of philosophy, of knowledge, trying to integrate in a way without conflict and opposition, this never-lasting fight between objectifying analytical philosophy of modern sciences, so third-person science, third-person philosophy, with this effort of objectifying by using symbolic language, dual symbolic language of logic, formal logic, and statistics for saying this is true or not. So a quantitative in a way and utilitarian way of deciding what is true or not, and what is illness or not, and phenomenology and experiential philosophy that is not interested in third person, even it's questioning if there is a third person, an objective third person. It's just me and you, or better, you and me, because the little baby becomes an me, an I, because of the you, the mother. So it's about intersubjectivity. It's not about an abstraction of something objective as a third person. That's much later, this capacity of objectifying. Maybe it's a mechanism of defense resistance to something, who knows? Okay, but what I try to say, is it possible to not to make a conflict between phenomenology, first person experience as epoche, as phenomenological reduction, and analytical philosophy? Is it a conflict, or can we put them together? That's my question. Because psychoanalysis, it's clear, it's making a good house with phenomenology more than with analytical philosophy, because it's first person experience. And Cadell said all the time, that's the difficulty. It's so easy to project in and to objectify something, but not being subjectively implied in this truth. For instance, always this story of the desire, the unconscious desire of the philosopher, or the unconscious desire of Lacan, or the unconscious desire of each of us here, or of Freud, or, you know. So that's and the question is this: what is, from an ontological point of view, what has primacy, the experience or the symbolic thinking in a dual language, as does analysis and logic? What's more important, the perceptive experience of the baby, the touch, the experience of seeing, of gaze, of whatever, so first I think it's experience, and then comes the symbolic, the division in yes, no, in. So what's the relation from an ontological point of view between these two registers?
I think
in ontology,
I think the way you're framing it is gorgeous, I just want to say, and I think that the specific way that you're relating the third person point of view to the you and me plus the baby that's what I want to emphasize. Is so brilliant the way you're framing that, because I do think that the third person point of view is actually the baby of science. Like the third person, it doesn't make sense. Like the third person point of view that science sort of deifies in the present moment is kind of science's baby. Yeah. And it's abstracted away from you and me and our baby. And I say for me, like, kind of like, in terms of my I've often referred to, for example, when I was writing my PhD thesis, it was almost like I was giving birth. It was my baby, and I had to clean myself after giving birth. I was dirty because I had just given birth. And I think that what I'm doing, so I like this metaphor here of bringing the you, me, and the baby, and that actually, like, that's what would be interesting, is bringing science. And I think that's all. And Mika, I'll get to you now. But for me, I just want to finish by saying, for me, I think where I'm going with, because I've always been scientifically informed and interested in science, and I'm not against science, but bringing science to the very process of intersubjectivity and reproduction and having a baby. We don't think about that. And paradoxically, I was just talking about this with another person, which is that the West is not reproducing. Like, we're not having babies. So on top of that, and then you have that juxtaposed and compared. I went to the park a few weekends ago, and I saw an Arabic and an African communities, and they all have huge families. So I just think this is interesting to think about, So Mika, I'll go to you.
Yeah. But yeah, to answer the latter question here, isn't it quite clear what's primary here? I think the primary thing is the historical split. And the idea between there being some kind of primacy of phenomenology, isn't it a kind of a like hysterical idea, a hysterical idealization? I mean, if phenomenology or consciousness would be the whole story, then there would be no need for psychoanalysis. I mean, the very idea of a Lacanian analysis is that there is some type of structure already operating when the historical split is enacted. And this structure can be perhaps described as the relation between the hysteric and the master, for example. And with regard to the question of, I mean, I don't quite grasp what you're saying or trying to ask about phenomenology and analytical philosophy. There has been a tradition from, I think, maybe 70s on and even continues today, and trying to bring analytical philosophy and phenomenology together. But with regard to phenomenology, I would say that there is a problem in primacy of phenomenology, because when, for example, you read Edmund Husserl, I mean, he's always enacting the philosophy or the phenomenological reduction of things. But if you were to question, why do you do the very acts? He would say that it's to further the science. It's to bring a system of sciences of sure knowledge in the Cartesian tradition. But if you were to ask, then why do you do it? What's the motive? Here is the Freudian question, which would have to give some kind of like unconscious motivation for it also, which has to do with very early stages of life, with even with like disgusting things, with sexuality and so on.
Yeah, it's we'll get to you, Eric. But I just want to emphasize that I love how Mika emphasized that what's primary between experience and language is the split, and I think that is what we get from Freud. And but I just want to say that in this split, there's a child. You know, like a baby. What's coming out of the split too? The split and what's coming out of the split. But Eric.
It is the child and the symptom.
Yeah. This, yeah. Eric?
Yeah, I don't want to interject into this conversation if anyone has anything else to say about it, because I wanted to kind of give more of an anecdote from my own experience. My field of study was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the history of the scholarship of the Dead Sea Scrolls is very interesting, and I think illustrative of where psychoanalysis brings a kind of lens into some of these faults or problems within the sciences. When the scrolls were discovered in the early 50s, I'm sorry, the late 40s into the 50s, it was a team of Catholic priests, largely, that were working at a French biblical school in Jerusalem, that were given charge of the scrolls and of the archaeological site at Qumran, and they immediately began to describe it as a kind of monastic settlement. Now, these were all Jesuits, right? They described a room as a I forget the name. They described all the different rooms of Qumran as these different places where certain monastic activities, a scriptorium, and these sort of things. And this group of mainly Catholic scholars held control over the Dead Sea Scrolls and kind of created a closed cabal that especially shut out Jewish scholarship from having anything to do with the scrolls. And they were very selective about which scrolls were being published and talked about in the literature. Specifically, they had been kind of sitting on some of the more Jewish halakhic text, and this created a lot of conflict. And they created this sort of narrative of this quasi-monastic Essene community that was living at this site and producing all of these scrolls, and they really kind of created this fantasy that held sway in scholarship for many decades. And it actually took some sort of surreptitious acts of people exposing the Dead Sea Scrolls to the broader world of scholarship, this kind of incursion of Jewish scholarship that, when it comes on the scene, is then very antagonistic towards the establishment. And then you have a current that is against this notion of the Essene identification. And my own professor, Norman Gold, was one of those, and he was completely blackballed from the Dead Sea Scrolls community of scholars, to the degree that just before he died, his son, Raphael Gold, actually assumed false identities and began a campaign of online harassment against certain scholars. So I say all that to just underscore how what can appear as an unbiased or scientific discipline, archaeology and philology and history and the study of religion and all this sort of thing, at the core of it is a deeply symptomatic forms of identification and unconscious desires that really determine the course of scholarship. And I think unless you, as a scholar, are at least in some way cognizant of your own unconscious motivations and specifically your identifications. And I think this notion of identification that Freud develops in the group psychology, that Lacan deals with in Seminar 9 and elsewhere, is very important. And so I think what Freud really is saying in these texts is something that all of these disciplines, whether science proper or humanities, definitely needs to take account of. And all we have to do is just look at the history of scholarship in any of these areas, and you'll see just how messy it is, and it plays out like a soap opera in many cases. So yeah.
Absolutely. That's, yeah, brilliantly said. I think that what I want to emphasize, and what you emphasize is the core of it, is these symptomatic forms of identification and unconscious desires are driving whether it's philology, whether it's religious studies, whether it's physics, whether it's biology, whether it's philosophy. We can't think and communicate as if symptomatic forms of identification and unconscious desire are playing no role. And I think that's how the university discourse would present it oftentimes, or certainly the master's.
There was one case where an English scholar, John Allegro, took custody of the copper scroll. It's a sheet of copper It actually has, it's very interesting. It has like a treasure map written in it on where to find all these caches of gold and silver. But it was rolled up, and he took custody of it to Manchester, and without permission, he actually got a team to actually saw open the copper scroll, and he transcribed it and published it. And he was so vilified for it and for his publication and for doing all of this that he ended up having a psychotic episode, and it totally ended his career. And it's just kind of one of those blights on scholarship, and so it's it's really interesting how these unconscious desires and even just the conflicts that ensue can end up having enormous ramifications.
Yes, I would like to add something. It's so interesting that you brought in discussion, Kadel, the problem of intimacy. And your example, Eric, is showing us that this intimacy, which is so important in exploring the truth, and this intimacy is, if it's not psychoanalyzed and explored with a lot of delicacy, it is an extimacy. So the most intimate place can be very terrifying, and so we have to put it away, to objectify, because otherwise we can become terrified of our most intimate place, topos. But what I would like to say, I could not read the whole text, but at the beginning I was impressed by a Freudian idea, and I will cite him. Normal processes and what are described as pathological ones follow the same rules. That's revolutionary, because he's raising up the question of what's normal and what's pathological. If they follow the same rules, this means that you do not have pathological mechanism which is different of what we call normal.
Yeah.
So our question should be, what is normal? Who decides what is normal? It's a social normativity. It's a phallus, a very powerful first signifier who decides the law. What's this delicate limit between normal and pathological? Freud is saying they follow the same rules. It's a problem of quantity. What's the difference? So he's making a revolution in pathogenesis of disease, of symptoms. That's very interesting for me.
Yep. This is this distinction, just for people watching, this has come up many times, and one of the most interesting things to observe in the history of Freud's thought is the way he starts with this distinction between normal and pathological, and quickly starts to see that this has no ground, and that actually everyone is actually kind of hysterical or neurotic in little ways, and that he was just studying sort of the tip of the iceberg, the most extreme cases in the beginning, and so to speak. Sandra, I think you had your hand up first, then Eric.
Yes. Well, I think that this is kind of the hysterical question of what is normal. I've also come up with it, then, because, okay, we can accept that outside of what we agree is allowed and permitted in the way we enact, in the way we relate to the others, and then of course there is this tendency to want to transgress, because then, okay, comes then comes the desires, the fantasies, and all this the sexual element that emerges from us, and then and how do we put it into word, and the anxiety it generates, and how do we put it into words. And then, but that is the something that is very important, the putting into words, right? Because then it just if it's not put into words, if it's not passed into this symbolic, as I understand all of this, is then something could happen. So then who exactly, like who decides what is normal? What I want to just emphasize is that this question, or this asking for somebody to tell us what is normal, is kind of like this the impulse to bring the other into to make it appear, to make the other appear, because we know there is no big other than we're asking for it to come up and tell us, okay, I'm going to tell you what is normal, what is permitted, what is allowed. And when we realize this, then we kind of like go, okay, what do we do now, right? How do we go? And I'm sorry, just a little bit further, we turn to psychoanalysis, we turn to philosophy, we turn to other disciplines to kind of like, okay, so who has said something about what, how to deal with this, with all of this mess that we have in society? And then I don't know, there's a question of primacy, there is a question of but I don't know, I just think that it is true. I mean, there is something beyond just consciousness, right? We have to, I do believe we have to accept there's, I don't know, it's been called animal, it's been called unconscious, but still structured in language. I don't know, that's kind of conflicting for me, because if it's an unconscious, I don't know, there's this weird mixture of symbolization of what is affection, and but I don't know, I think I just wanted to add that this desire of bringing the other into existence, I think, is what's kind of like, I've been thinking about it, but I'll stop there.
Because
interrupt?
yeah, go ahead, Mika.
Yeah, I think that this is really precise formulation of what I've also been thinking about when we are hearing this call or this demand for the other to sort of like come and give us some kind of normality that we can then contest. It is a hysterical reaction, but it is a question also, reaction then to what? Well, there is a conflict in the person's mental life, Freud tells us. The symptom is always a kind of like compromise formation for some kind of conflict in the person's psyche. So when there is this, to repeat what you were saying, I mean, it's exactly what, yeah. When there is this like hysterical question of, well, what is normal? Who can decide what is normal? I am not normal, but you are telling me that I should accept this normal so that I can refuse then being normal. Well, yeah, I mean, the form is quite hysterical.
Okay, I just Eric or Javier, which one of you do you think connect to this line of?
I think I can try.
Okay, all right.
I think what Alexandra and Sandra were saying, which was just marvelous. This notion of intimate versus extimate that Lacan creates, this notion of the extimate, which fits in with what Sandra was saying about the big other. The big other is a field. It's kind of like the Higgs field. It's always out there, and big others kind of pop in and out of existence, and when a big other goes away, we're looking for another one. We're looking for some external something out there to prop up our own unconscious. What I wanted to give kind of as an example of this, as long as I'm on the thought of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is one particular scroll. It's called the Thanksgiving hymns, or the Hodayot, and it's written by ostensibly someone who was the creator or leader of this sect, and he goes off page after page of doggerel hymn. I thank thee, O Lord, that thou hast set my feet upon the correct path of knowledge, and he's thanking God for giving him the correct interpretation of the Torah that he has now used to create this synagogue of this sect of people that are doing it the right way, in distinction to the Jerusalem temple and the Pharisees and so on. And so and before I had discovered psychoanalysis as a discipline, I thought, my goodness, this guy is a megalomaniac. He's not only has he created this sect, but he believes that it is God who has inspired him to do this and given him this knowledge. And this is precisely, I think, what both Alexandra and Sandra were kind of talking about, is this need to create this extimate support of this big other that establishes an identity for us to hang on to, a normalcy. And I think that bringing this back to Freud and our text for this session, is that all of these disciplines, science, the humanities, art, religion, philosophy, are these external media through which we prop up the big other. We use these external disciplines of knowledge, and we just cannot help ourselves but create big others, something extimate out of them.
All right, Javier, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go next. I like how Noon already. I'm going to agree with Noon here about the moment you ask what is normal, it's already hysterical. That's like the whole paradox about the whole thing that I enjoyed. I just already imagine like a guy itching, like, is this normal? It's already hysterical. Because I just started thinking about the times I've been a nurse and like a guy's itching. He's like, yeah, but like, is this normal? And it's funny because you're like, yeah, it's normal with the disease. Yeah, it's completely normal. And the other thing is normality. We've made it a fetish. It's completely a fetish to be normal. That's the funny thing about normalcy, is that we made it a fetish. And the other thing is, if we want to take psychoanalysis seriously with the unconscious, we could almost, correct me if I'm using it wrong, but I almost feel like the way we use normalcy is kind of like the objet art. It's the thing that prevents us from getting the thing, right? If we're so obsessed about normalcy and what that means for us, we're so attracted to, well, is this normal, right? Rather than entertaining the other possibilities. And I feel like that's critical, because this also brings me up with what Freud talked about with education, and sublimation, where this is no longer paid attention to in some degree. Because I remember having a discussion at work about school shootings, right? And I said, I proposed the idea that, we have to kind of psychologically study the reasons why this shooter begins in the first place. And someone told me, like, well, they have. And I said, yes, but they've only used one type of psychology to understand. I doubt that they're using psychoanalysis to understand the reason why the children are shooting at schools in the first place, right? I really doubt that they're using psychoanalysis. I'm pretty sure there has been some kind of psychoanalysis. I haven't encountered it yet, but my main point was, we're only using one kind of psychology to understand the children. It typically is only the popular kind, and that was just like some of the immediate kind of thoughts that came to my mind when I was reading Freud's kind of thing about education. So I'll leave it there.
I don't know how this is not this is more of like something I thought in a popular way, not a academic way, but I watched the TV series Mindhunter. Has anyone else seen the TV series Mindhunter? Is that totally in a void? But like, didn't that sort of go into a little bit the tensions within the crime community about psychological motivation? That there was the guy who was doing the original investigations into the explosion of serial killers was constantly looking for an unconscious psychological motive, like why did this, there was a particularly horrible serial killing, and it couldn't be explained through any rational psychological framework. But I just wonder the degree to which the unconscious psyche is explored in these crime, because when we're dealing with serial killers, or when we're dealing with just these types of very strange crimes, of course the unconscious pathology is the motivating factor. And I just wonder the degree. I have no idea the degree to which it's accepted within these disciplines or not. I don't know. Like, I can say also, like, another thing, just basing off that, I watched the documentary about 9/11. There's a new documentary about 9/11 I've been watching, and again, psychoanalysis is so relevant, but like, really what we need is like a psychoanalysis of reaction to traumatic events, because like everything that started to happen in reaction to 9/11 was just so too base level reactive, and not deep enough into unconscious knowledge of the motivation systems.
But I would like to ask something. If you are talking about this killers and crimes and aggressivity and the unconscious motive for it, as I understood, the whole psychoanalysis is telling us that the motive is sexual. So sexuality is fueling aggressivity and death drive.
Yeah, I was going to add also, yeah.
So I think this very delicate subject of exploring sexuality and sexual drives, and in which way they can provoke such events, such tragedies, would be very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? It's sexual, or it's sexual in the sense of libido, of
for like
death drive, of
absolutely. I mean,
jouissance.
Absolutely, we could go into specific cases. The one that I've analyzed like the most closely for me was I went to analyze like the the psychology of Ted Bundy and the serial killers in that sense, and it was definitely a jouissance explosion in him, which probably was traced back to potentially a father complex issue, but not sure how deep we can go into it now, because it takes us really far afield.
Just to comment on this point, well, since Freud is presenting some kind of sociological interest of psychoanalysis in this paper, would it be more at home talking about guilt and suffering from like some type of punitive structures in which the person lives, and not so much focus on, I don't know, releasing the sexuality of the person or something like that? I mean, Freud's saying that, well, psychoanalysis does focus on an individual case by case. Well, but in investigating the individual, it could not avoid dealing with the emotional basis of the relation of the individual to society. So the relation is the key here.
Yeah, that's a good point. It just brings to mind, yeah, in the Bundy situation, he started to go on a killing rampage when he realized that he had no idea what to do with his jouissance in relationship to actual women. So he couldn't situate himself in relationship to the other. He didn't know how to situate himself in relationship to the other. So there was just this, I don't know if he had guilt about that. I don't know. I don't think that's the right word. But I don't know. This is a huge topic. I don't know how, if we open that up, where it would go. But how do I pronounce your name? But someone has their hand right. Linus.
Ines, with an I at the beginning.
Okay.
Ines.
Yeah. Ines. Okay.
Yeah. Just like in connection with this discussion of education and shame and the sort of primacy of the sexual instinct in children, this brings to my mind a case which took place in my hometown, Helsinki, in Finland, of this case where very recently 2 16-year-old kids killed, or rather tortured to death, a schoolmate of the same age. And this was like a huge thing, like a tragedy of the nation, at least of the city. And it is something that still like pops up in the news, and like speculations about how could this have taken place. And, you know, everybody seems to be very perplexed about how is this possible. And particularly in this case, the case was so, I guess, traumatic or unusual in the sense that the victim actually almost allowed himself to be killed in this situation. So he kind of offered himself to the torture and killing. And it seems that in the analysis of this case, in the news and so forth, it always comes up again and again that the classmates had no idea about this. Teachers had no idea that this kind of like situation was taking place, that this kind of bullying was going on, which like it is very difficult to avoid the thought that there must have been like some indications somewhere that somebody could have like caught some sort of clue that maybe this was taking place. But because it is so difficult to think about this, and because it is so terrifying, especially for teachers who would be in the prime position of responsibility to actually stop something like this from taking place. And it seems that this kind of psychoanalytic understanding for teachers would be like of primary value, especially in cases like this, because it seems that the sort of denial or inability to deal with the fact of human aggression and the primacy of the the sexual instinct and the necessity of sublimating it in some way. It seems, at least to me as a teacher student, that it's almost impossible to think about this, like the problem of sublimation in education. It's something that it's such a difficult topic, it's such a difficult problem that it seems like in teacher education they don't even want to deal with it. So you talk about it in some sense, and you sort of emphasize for example these days, the importance of affect in education and so forth. But sexuality, of course, this doesn't come up ever, and aggression only in very limited and sort of in relation to kind of fringe cases. But to think that aggression and sexuality would be basic to all human beings,
Ines?
Yes?
Ines, and why do you think it's a taboo, Tana? Why do you think it's taboo in education?
Why do I think it's taboo in education,
Mhm.
in particular? Well, that's a good question. I don't know why in education. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is because it's such a difficult thing to actually incorporate into formal education institutions. How do you begin to restructure education from a kind of Freudian basis? Education would have to be very different from how it is today. For example, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but
No, go on, finish your thought.
no, well, one thing that came to my mind, for instance, before was the idea of the tension between science as something that de-emphasizes sexuality and art as something that or creative endeavor as something that emphasizes sexuality, and the fact that still today education or formal education mostly consists of science, and this is not something that most people are going to actually grow up to do. Not most people are going to grow up to be scientists, but most education consists of this nonetheless. So if it was actually taken seriously, this need for formal education to provide a basis for all students to be able to sublimate their sexual and their libido in the process of education, education, even at the basic level of curriculum and the subject matter, it would have to look very different. So it would be just a huge process to change it. Yeah.
Really, really well said. Mika, did you want to go directly on that, or?
Yeah, just a short comment that came to my mind. Well, I love the way that you gave the case of the killing of the child in Helsinki. But what is really, as you said, should gain our attention in this case is the way that the educators, the parents, emphasize the way that they did not know anything of it. They couldn't see it coming. So it almost reminds me of the way that Freud characterizes in his own time, the way that caretakers ignore systematically certain sexual actions. And what came to my mind in connection to this is that well, the Freudian notion of the unconscious, it's something that's implicated in mistakes of the tongue and symptoms, neurotic actions. And one can say, I think very definitely, that it is a delicate construction. It's very delicate. And it's something that's in this current economical situation, it is there, but is it really? I mean, in some cases, we can today perhaps question if the unconscious is itself even constituted.
What do you mean? Can you expand on that notion?
It's a difficult topic, and it takes us far ahead from the current focus, since we would have to focus on new pathologies which do not have unconscious as a construction, since unconscious implicates the introduction of a symbolic, right? It's something that has to do with sexuality, with mistakes, with dream formations. So is it possible that we have traumatized people enough so that they are what Zizek calls the post-traumatic, non-libidinal subjects?
Yeah. Frozen in affect. What's coming to my mind, I'm not sure how well it ties in to the direction you were taking it there, but it is just something that I've noticed in what Ines was emphasizing, is that schools are more, not just school, but even like, for example, in cognitive science, they'll emphasize embodied cognition. Ines was saying that in school, they'll recognize the importance of affect, but then you recognize the importance of affect, you recognize the importance of embodied cognition in the cognitive science case, but then sexuality and aggression is something that you can't talk about still, like, or like somehow, like, so then what are you talking about? Like when you're talking about affect, like what are you talking, like when you talk about embodied cognition, but I can't talk about sexuality, then what are you talking about? Like you're saying embodied cognition, what are you talking about then? Like, so it's almost like they have to come up with it's almost like the ultimate form of displacement. It's like because it is naming the thing, but it's doing it in a displaced way, and if you point out that it's displaced, you don't get a rational conversation, you get more resistance. So I do agree with the basic idea that if you included sublimation, and increasingly what I think this is just influenced by Freud directly, but like just the art of sublimation. If you include the art of sublimation into an educational system, all of education would be different. It would change it so fundamentally that the system as it exists now can't handle the truth of that, because it would be undermining itself. It would be going against its own pleasure principle. It would be unpleasurable to undermine the entire system. It would mean we have to relearn everything. It would mean we have to restructure everything. Much better to just put a weird unconscious displacement symbol and say affect is important. You know, like it's absurd to such an insane degree. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to supplement what you were saying, or make it more exact, you were saying that it would have to transform the situation, but it would have to deal with capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, they'd have to deal with capitalism, yeah.
Now, what I think, maybe, I don't know, Mika is trying to say, even if I don't think it has to do strictly with capitalism, it has to do with human nature, is that aggressivity means power. It is a lot of power in this sexual drive that manifests aggressively. And in order to sublimate it, you have to become aware of this power. So it's maybe a fear of this power. That's why it's a taboo subject, because you have to open the Pandora's box, and to explore this power.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say also that this type of reduction of social relations, of symbolic structure, is very anti-Lacanian, but it's also possibly an apology for capitalism, this naturalization of the situation.
What do you understand by naturalization of the situation?
Well, what you were saying, that we need to bring some kind of power relation or aggressivity as a natural factor.
No, I did not say to be, just to explore it.
Well, let me. Can I give? Let me give a concrete example, because I have actual engagement with the education system on this problem. So my engagement with the educational system on this problem was, I think this is super interesting. I met this doctoral student who was studied Freud, knew Freud, and was interested in having conversations with primary school children about death. That was her doctoral topic. She wanted to have conversations with primary school children about death as a doctoral topic. Now, here's the interesting thing for our conversation, I think. She had no resistance at all from the children themselves. The children themselves wanted to talk about death. They were excited to talk about death. Oh my God, we can talk about it. Let's go into it. What is it? Who knows? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's this. I think about this. The resistance she had was from the educational staff itself. The educational staff itself did not want the kids to talk about death. This is the problem, is that the teachers themselves, the educational professionals themselves, are scared of themselves. They're scared of their own sexuality. They're scared of their own death. If we did a whole education system that taught sublimation, the first people we would have to teach are the teachers. Like I think that's the level of the.
I have a question.
We have to be philosophers. Sorry.
Sorry. Would you think it is a question of fearing the putting into words of something that transcends? Because I mean, if it has to do with something beyond, like death, how would you put death into words?
I think as soon as you put, in my experience, as soon as you put sex and death too directly into words, you confront an overwhelming anxiety.
Yes.
So like for example, let me give a really practical example, is that it's actually, I think, pretty emotionally easy to act out polyamory without talking about it. But as soon as you talk about it with other people who you're doing it with, it becomes a whole different ballgame. It becomes anxiety provoking to an insane level. So, but if you don't talk about it, then it's not anxiety provoking. So as soon as you talk about it, it changes the game. So I think that's my view. I don't know if that's true. That's my experience.
Just to add on, I mean, just think about, like, when I went through school, right? You had to give your parents the permission slip so you could learn about sex at school, right? This is how anxiety provoking it was, right? The whole institution was like, we have to give a permission slip. We have to ask the parents if it's okay, right? But the thing is, I remember as a child, I thought this was ridiculous because, it's funny, the way I learned about sex, my mom gave me a book, for crying out loud. She didn't even really talk to me. She just gave me a book. And like, that was the most interaction that I had. But of course she was willing to sign the form because she didn't want to talk about it. So it was like another way for her to displace herself from it and put it in the school's hands. But at the same time, the school doesn't want to be responsible either. So they're like asking the parents. So there's this constant back and forth of like, no, you talk about it. No, I don't want to talk about it. You talk about it. And I just find that so funny because Freud is really talking about something important.
Freud is a monster. Like, Freud is monstrous like to do what he did in the time period he did, and with the clarity and rigor, like to me, it's unbelievable that the papers he wrote are as clear and understandable as they are. Like, in order to do this, to investigate this for the first time, I would expect almost Freud and Lacan to be opposite, because Lacan is actually like obscure and difficult to read, and Freud is very clear and easy to understand. But I would almost think it should be the reverse, that Freud is impossible to understand, impenetrable, and Lacan then makes it clear. But it's like the opposite for some reason, which I've just thought about for the first time. I don't know why that is. Mika, did you have your hand up? Did you want to? No. Okay.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, I would have to say that I definitely agree that, I mean, really Freud is kind of like an education for the mind. It's incredible how much progression he made just on his own and with the help of his friends. I mean, it brings almost to mind the Beatles songs, with a little help from my friends and so on. But yeah, we need a community, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and we need a community, and at least in my experience with academia, I've always sought I've always sought to embed my intellect in a community of friends. Basically, what I mean by a community of friends is like people where we have like an authentic shared passion for discussing that subject, and we like have a somewhat enjoyable relationship with each other outside of the academic context or inside the academic context. Doesn't make any difference. But it's almost like on that level, the modern academic structure, as I experienced it, is set up in such a way as to eradicate that dimension of it. You know, like and in that context, I like the idea that's been tarried around, and this is probably leaving the context of this conversation a little bit too much, but I like the idea of the guild, that we bring back the thinkers guild, that we bring back small communities of deep learning, you know, where the whole embodied person is included in the process. I don't know how to make that a reality, but it's, yeah. There's an incredible amount of progress that you can make with a small group of dedicated individuals. I don't know if we wanna maybe have space for wrapping up, but if there's anyone who has anything to say about you know, the major theme of this session, which is basically psychoanalysis's relationship to other knowledge disciplines. Of course, we focused on a paper that was directly related to psychology, and we focused on a paper that was related to non-psychological sciences in general. So if there's any final thoughts, and if not, I will just do a little summary.
I have a question.
Yep. Go for it.
I try to suppress my question, but I'm not capable of it. From a symbolic point of view, and if we think about some paper of Freud about his dream and an injection, is the injection a symbol for the phallus?
Don't know if anyone else wants to take that.
It's a phallic symbol.
Yeah.
The injection is a phallic symbol of power or not? That was my question.
You mean the vaccine?
No, I mean.
I think you're talking about Irma's injection, right?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Huh?
You're talking about
It was out
Irma,
of
right?
context. Yeah.
Yes. Sandra. Yes. Kader. Yes. Is this a phallic symbol of power or not in a psychoanalytic language or not?
Well, I don't know 100%, but I would say it's possible. Yes, I think so.
Freud
I would-
admits.
Yeah, I would say.
admits this.
Okay, Javier, if you know, please say. Yeah.
I mean, it's because I'm still reading it. The Freud, the problem with the Irma's injection is that he was feeling castrated because the patient in his actual life said that he couldn't cure her, so he wanted it to be another patient. So you could say that the injection is him inserting himself, his power of being correct, right? He wanted to be correct. I know that he didn't directly say that the injection was his power, but I think we can interpret this way because the way that he describes this dream is that he wanted the patient, his real patient that he was dealing with, to be another patient. And Irma's injection was him dealing with this other patient in the dream to assert that he was correct in his diagnosis. He wanted to be correct in his diagnosis. And I think what you're getting at, it could be, and I think there's material to support that when Freud talks about that the way his dream distorted itself, he wished that it was another patient, because then it would mean that he was correct. So,
Thank you.
No.
Thank you, Javier. That was very clear. Okay, so I will just do a little summary for mostly the viewers watching this after, I suppose, but it might be also useful for you guys. We basically covered 2 papers. We covered the claims, all right, the claims of psychoanalysis to scientific interest, which was mostly focused on psychoanalysis' relationship to psychology. We also focused on the claims of psychoanalysis to the interest of non-psychological sciences, which focused on many other disciplines and psychoanalysis' relationship to philology, philosophy, biology, development, history and civilization, aesthetics, sociology, and education. And I think that in our conversation, we ultimately push towards, I think towards the end, education as a whole. And the way in which unconscious symptoms and unconscious desires are structuring a lot of our knowledge practices and structures of civilization still to a degree that is paradoxically unthought. And the reasons why are complex, and how to change it is not quite clear. But nonetheless, I think it's just as timely, and that's why it's so interesting to do this return to Freud, is because all of the things he's talking about, or at least many of the things he's talking about, still have just as much relevance today as they did when he was writing over a century ago. And I think that was from the very beginning of the first paper, where he's talking about the circle of savants who want to synthesize the sciences. That describes almost perfectly the way I see a lot of people in the sciences still to this day. So it's so strange how nothing has really changed at all. And maybe that's why psychoanalysis is becoming so popular in philosophy today, because we need a broader conversation about psychoanalysis and its meaning for our society and history as a whole. And so I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your time and attention during the presentation, and also for the discussion afterwards. Peace out, guys.
Thank you.
Thank